Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We're so excited to have you join us. My name is Jessica Zavala, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health to today's webinar, The Mental Health Implication of Perfectionism in American College Students. Before I introduce our presenter today, I do have a few brief announcements to share. First and foremost, CME CEU credits are available. The activity code for today's session is 55 SPIL. I will spell that out for you. That's 55 SPIL. And this code will expire on tomorrow, May 24th at 1 p.m. So please be on the lookout for information periodically posted via the chat function regarding how to obtain credits if you are interested. This is our final webinar for the series for this year. Thank you to everyone who has participated this year. And I do want to say this, we really value your feedback and input on the topics that are selected. And with that being said, please be on the lookout for a topic survey. Again, we want to have your input on topics that we offer in the future. And so we hope that you will join us again for the 2023-2024 academic series. Also, thank you if you joined us for the 6th biennial conference that was held in Columbus. How exciting it was to be back in person and to see so many smiling faces, networking and collaborating. We encourage you to post questions and comments in the Q&A or chat function during today's presentation. And finally, this webinar will be recorded and the video will be made available for viewing on our YouTube channel. And now to introduce our presenter, Dr. Mikail Brown. Dr. Brown is a native of Southern California and is a clinician specializing in traumatology with the goal of helping all those who have survived the worst life has to throw at them. Dr. Brown has a Bachelor of Arts degree in interdisciplinary studies, a Master of Science in General Psychology, and a doctorate in clinical psychology. She also holds 3 seminary degrees. Wow, that's someone who's really busy. Her passion for helping others expands beyond clinical work. She is Associate Professor of Psychology at various Southern California colleges, bringing her passion for the field into the classroom. Dr. Mikail is also a social justice advocate who desires to do her part for injustice. She champions for minorities, understanding the journey personally. She also volunteers her time through one of her 2 organizations, Your Beautiful Mind Incorporated, a nonprofit organization dedicating to educating on mental health and connecting people with free and low-cost mental health services. The Black Consciousness Collective Incorporated, a nonprofit advocating for and empowering the Black collective, and is a proud member of Sigma Gamma Rho Incorporated. Without further ado, Dr. Mikail Brown.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I am so excited to be here. I'm ready to get into it if everyone is ready. I am going to share my screen. So the learning objectives for this session, I know that you guys have already received this, but I just wanted to review them quickly, is we're going to identify the symptoms of perfectionism in college students. We're going to understand what the correlation is between perfectionism and mental health issues in college students. And also I will try to identify some resources for you as stakeholders in the college and higher education realm that can assist students that are dealing with mental health issues due to perfectionism. Next slide. No problem. If you launch the poll here, I wanted us to kind of start off with seeing what it is that you believe perfectionism. So simply answer, how would you define it? Is it setting high goals and standards? Is it the need to be or appear to be perfect? Or setting unrealistic high goals and standards? And so we'll give you guys a few minutes to choose what your answer will be. All right, let's go ahead and close out the poll and see what answers we have. So we have 7% of you define it as setting high goals and standards. 44% of you define it as the need to be or appear to be perfect. And 49% of you, about half, define it as setting unrealistic high goals and standards. So I want you all to know that all of these answers are actually correct. And we're going to get into when this is actually problematic to have high goals and standards. Next slide. So I often get this question, what is perfectionism? Is it just simply striving to be perfect? And so I really want us to dig deeper into defining what that is and understanding how this can connect to our mental health. Next slide. Simplistic definition is that perfectionism is striving for flawlessness, as well as setting exceedingly high standards for performance. And it's usually accompanied by tendencies for overly critical evaluation. This is really important because the striving for excellence is not a problem. There's nothing wrong for wanting to do things at a high standard, but there is healthy ways of striving for perfection and there are unhealthy ways. Next slide. So let's get into the unhealthy ways. We have 3 elements that come with perfectionism. The first one is holding standards that are impossibly high. And so it's one thing to look at yourself and criticize yourself and critique yourself. That's fine, but it can go beyond what you actually have the capability of doing, which can be problematic. Number 2, judging your own efforts and other people's with a fierce form of criticism. Again, criticism is not bad, but if you are basing this on things that are not realistic in the way you are critiquing a situation, for example, the person just does not have the capability, they do not have the knowledge base in order to be able to achieve that standard and goal, then it is fierce criticism. And then the last one, which I think a lot of people at some point in time in our lives deal with, is basing your sense of worth on whether or not those standards are actually met. This is problematic, not just for college students, but for people in general, because we are actually looking at who we are and how we value ourselves based on being able to reach these standards that are oftentimes too high for us to actually meet. Next slide. So perfectionism can actually show up in very different ways from person to person, and it depends on the factors that are there. I wanted to kind of highlight some areas that'll make it easier for you as stakeholders to be able to identify what it is that you could possibly be seeing. Usually when it comes to perfectionism, their behaviors will fall into 1 or 2 categories. Either it's helping them maintain high standards, or it's helping them avoid situations which continues to remind them that they need to be perfect. So that's that procrastination piece. There's also very rigid ways of looking at their behavior, their thought process, their patterns, etc. The way you will see this play out is in their academic performance. So you will see it academically. You will also see it in the workspace. You can often see it by how they organize their area. So neatness, cleanliness, organization, their physical appearance, and health and grooming. Again, these things on the surface are not bad things, but when they're accompanied to being attached to your self-worth and how you value yourself, that is when it becomes very problematic. Next slide. So this is kind of a know the facts before we get into breaking down the different areas or different ways we can see perfectionism. 33% is the increase that has happened between 1989 and 2016. So the journal article that I actually referenced to get a lot of my information did a longitudinal study, and they actually looked at between those years, every year, the increase of perfectionism in college students. And they found that social and familial expectation was the most pressing issue that caused this increase. It had the highest amount of increase. Next slide. So let's break down the different types of perfectionism. There are three common types that are looked at. The first one is self-oriented perfectionism. I demand nothing less of than perfection of myself. So a self-oriented perfectionist, they are striving to meet unrealistically high standards. And this form of perfectionism is usually inherited personality traits, which means parts of their personality that's shaped and formed based on their upbringing and their environment is going to personify in this particular form of perfectionism. It also can contribute, yes, in a positive way, to academic achievement and success, but it's usually associated with high levels of stress and other negative physical and mental health issues. The next one is socially prescribed perfectionism. This is my family expects me to be perfect. So this type of perfectionism also strives to meet unrealistic standards, but it's driven by their family and their cultural values and assumptions. So it's not necessarily what is said to them, it is what is sometimes assumed. This type of perfectionism is often particular to students that are the first in their family to attend college, which is really key. A lot of us, depending on what our role is as a stakeholder in the higher ed system, we will be dealing with students who will be the first one to venture off into higher education. A lot of pressure comes with that. So according to the study that I read and I'm referencing for this presentation, the number of young adults with socially prescribed perfectionism showed the largest increase of the three. So that was what that 33% was. And they also found that this type of perfectionism was linked to very severe mental health disorders. And they found an increased parallel with anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation over a particular time frame. The last form or type of perfectionism is imposed by others. So the people who matter to me should never let me down. So they're imposing it onto other people. They hold the people around them to very extremely high standards. They tend to blame and criticize their family, their friends, their colleagues when they fall short of the expectations that they have for them. And this type of perfectionism interferes with their relationships. And it can also create issues such as mistrust, conflict, and loneliness. It can also be a component of narcissism. So this had about a 13% or 16% increase over the 3 decades of the study that I'm referencing for this particular presentation. Next slide. So I want us to get into the causes because I feel like as a psychologist, that's the first place we go. What is the cause of this particular issue? And understanding the cause will allow us to be able to address it in a more effective way. There's no simple answer. If you ask if perfectionism is biological, you can't just give a yes or no answer to that. It's a lot more involved. Next slide. So here are ways for us to answer the different factors that play a part in perfectionism. So yes, there is a biological factor. Twin studies are how we are able to try to account for whether or not genetics plays a role in an issue. And they have found that perfectionism has about a 25 to 40% genetic component to explain why perfectionism is happening. And so, although this is considered to be moderate, they feel like the genetic link is usually associated with issues of anxiety, distress, depression, or low tolerance from a biological perspective. Next slide. So there are relational factors, and the quality of a child's relationship with their primary caregivers basically sets the stage for who they are going to become. And it also can set the stage for the development of perfectionism. As a caregiver, the parent is often not understanding that they're unconsciously setting a stage to where the child feels that they have to be perfect in order for them to get love and affection. And so this is perceived in a very rigid way. And as they age and develop and get to the higher education portion of their life, you will find that they have very rigid ways of looking at the relationship between being perfect and being accepted and loved. And so You'll even find that if there's no trauma in their background, don't find any trauma there, they still can have these rigid viewpoints when it comes to their worth and acceptance and them performing. And so that is directly related to the relational factors that happened over their early development. Next slide. I feel like this one is probably one of the bigger pieces that we often overlook, and it's cultural factors. We absorb cultural messages and standards and value from the society at large. So we live in a society where we have 24-hour news cycles, we have social media. All of these things are giving messages to children and young adults. And so those messages are influencing how they view the way they should perform and what they should be. A lot of times, because of these factors, social media, the news, etc., they are looking at a competitive individualism. So that cooperation is not what's actually being emphasized. Competition is being emphasized, and being an individual is emphasized. And with that, and the market-oriented form that we have in Western cultures, which is about achieving money, etc., the rise of this kind of contributes directly to the tendency to strive for perfectionism in all of the different types of ways. Cannot get away from cognitive factors. So people with a trauma history will have issues with cognitive distortions. Those cognitive distortions are often the hallmark of perfectionism. So some of the cognitive distortions that they may be dealing with is catastrophic thinking, selective attention to negative thinking, all or nothing thinking. All of these distortions are the undercurrents of perfectionism. And sometimes making those assumptions about what's happening is also what leads them to this distorted viewpoint from a mental standpoint. So they have to be taught how to restructure in order for them to get out of this cognitive hole that they found themselves in. Next slide. And this last one as a factor is learned behaviors. I kind of link this with cultural factors. This is the fact that in society, especially Western cultures, having high standards is often rewarded with positive attention, which reinforces perfectionist behavior. So feeling criticized over making a mistake will feel like a punishment, where they see being praised as positive attention. So the shift that we've seen in higher education over the decades, where it went from providing young people with a broader knowledge base to a meritocracy, has basically caused the students to equate their value to their academic performance. Where it simply was enough to learn the information, now it's about driving the achievement. So that doctrine of meritocracy is falsely reinforcing that academic and personal achievement, status, wealth, etc., is what causes a person to have value. And so for a college student, what that will look like, it will center around them getting good grades. It will center around them performing if they're a student athlete. And then on the other side of the coin for them, they'll be terrified of having a low or a failing grade. Next slide. So I want us to dig in and start looking at the correlation between perfectionism and mental health. Often the question is always asked when we talk about these types of things, is this a disorder? So is perfectionism a disorder? The answer is no. It's more a tendency that underlines other serious mental health disorders. So although it's an excessive need for approval and to be accepted socially, it is not necessarily within itself a disorder. Next slide. The increase in perfectionism as well as the increase in psychopathology is linked because perfectionism is actually a core vulnerability that has been identified to various disorders, various symptoms, as well as various syndromes. So perfectionism and mental health are related in the sense that perfectionism plays a role in the development of the continuation of many serious mental health conditions. So from a psychological perspective, when we're looking at what causes a person to develop a disorder versus another person, we can talk about the diathesis stress model, which is very commonly taken if there's a vulnerability that a person already has from their childhood or biologically, they live a high stress life, that will lead to them developing a disorder where a person that does not have that may not have that same issue. Unfortunately, in this case with perfectionism, we often overlook this as a possible vulnerability that can be a part of the equation. It's usually things like trauma or abuse, etc., is used as what creates the vulnerability, but perfectionism can now be put in that equation as something that can make them vulnerable to possibly developing a disorder. Next slide. Some of the disorders that have been correlated to perfectionism: social anxiety, high functioning anxiety, where they do deal with generalized anxiety disorder, but you find that they're high functioning. So sometimes it's challenging for you to identify immediately that that is what they're dealing with. Obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, depression, and then you can also add to this list body dysmorphic disorder. So very skewed and false views of their body, as well as suicidal ideation. So recognizing and addressing the connections between perfectionism and these disorders is important for the recovery process. Next slide. So supporting the students. I believe all of you are here because your question is, how do we reach out and assist the students who are dealing with these issues? So the strategies that I'm going to give you are strategies that are used to address the problems where you observe them having the challenges. So practical consideration is going to have to be important when you look at what your intervention course of action will be. You need to match the intervention and the practical considerations to each student in order for you to see optimal progress in their behavior. Next slide. So I'm going to start with professors and instructors because I feel like you guys are the front line of defense when it comes to this. And in all honesty, you're sometimes the counselor, you're sometimes the parent to them, the surrogate parent. You fill in a lot of gaps for students, especially those who are younger in their higher education journey and need a little bit more guidance and support. They come to their instructors for pretty much everything. So these are just some tips that I think are really helpful, that if you put these in place, it can assist with reducing the issue of perfectionism rearing its head in a student. First one is praising efforts over results, praising the efforts over the results. This is really key because oftentimes, again, the meritocracy, the achieving of the grade itself is overlooked instead of the effort that has been put in. Did they do the best that they could do? And making sure that you are supporting them so that they can learn from where there may be areas of improvement to be able to link that to better performance in the future. So it's not just about the grade, but it's also about allowing them to look at the effort that they put in there. The second one is to emphasize realistic goals. I often start the semester with part of my getting to know you activities in my classes with asking students what their majors are, what they would like to do professionally with that major. That might be a place to start with asking them what their goals are and giving them guidance on realistic ways to reach those goals. If you emphasize that the goals should be practical and realistic, not saying that you shouldn't have a high bar, but we also have to look at what resources and what information we have available to us when we are goal setting. And maybe there needs to be several steps before they get to that lofty goal. Not saying they'll never get to it, but it might take several steps for them to get to that place. Number 3 is breaking down long-term goals. I'm really big on this about not trying to eat the elephant whole, breaking it down into bite by bite. They can have the long-term goal, even if you have them work backwards, which is often a strategic way of analyzing information. Break the goal down into small pieces. And I'll add to this, I often tell people to celebrate the wins. It doesn't have to be you achieve the whole degree. You pass this class, which is part of the journey to the long-term goal. Learning how to celebrate those things is also positive from a mental health standpoint. Number 4, encourage them to have appropriate risk taking. Risk taking is necessary because you have to take risk in order to have reward, but you want to make sure that it is appropriate risk taking. You don't want them to set themselves up to not only fail, but to set themselves up to see things in a negative way that actually could be counterproductive. So we want to encourage appropriate risk taking. 5, focus on the process. The process is important. The journey of how they're getting there is important. So we often jump to, I just want to get to the goal. We want that microwave version of things. Teach the students how to focus on the process of getting there and to actually enjoy the process of getting there. Yes, I'm in my very first semester of my undergraduate degree. I have at least 4 years before I get to graduation. But the process of going through this, I can focus on the different pieces of the process and actually enjoy what is happening along the way. And then the last one, I feel like this is kind of preaching to the choir. So if you are a professor and you're not using rubrics, I don't know too many anymore that don't do this. Rubrics are important. And the reason why is because the rubrics actually tell them up front what the expectations are for them for an assignment and what grade will come with that. So if they know up front, if I do this, I'm going to get this grade, that takes a lot of pressure off of them when it comes to performance, and they can meet a very clear, defined goal. Next slide. So here's some recommendations of things that you could implement. The first is have practice test taking. And I'll also add with this, if they're writing papers, have ways to allow them to submit drafts for those papers, because that will also be very helpful for them. If they can submit, get feedback immediately in real time with the test taking or with the draft of a paper to see where they can improve, it will directly correlate to the final grade on a particular assignment. So usually test taking, paper writing causes a whole lot of anxiety in general. And if you're dealing with a perfectionist student, it will be even higher. So by allowing this practice, they will be more confident, not only in their test taking, but also in their writing abilities when they're putting together a paper. The second one, use cooperative activities. I talked about the fact that competition is kind of taken over as a theme when it comes to academic institutions. It's not about just getting the information. It's now about I'm competing as an individual. If you have cooperative activities in your class or even on the campus, this teaches them that they don't have to compete against each other. They're working together cooperatively to compete against a particular goal or challenge. And by doing that, they're learning how to interact, and they're no longer seeing every time people as competition, but more as a partner on a journey. Number 3, when you do group work, make sure that you outline the group members' responsibilities. A lot of teachers, myself included, love to use group activities because, again, this shows a cooperation. But part of the challenge with not defining what the group members are going to do is it can cause conflicts, and you always have that perfectionist overachiever who does so much that they're actually stressed out by the activity. So if you outline what their responsibilities are, they don't need to feel like they have to control the whole group. Let them know these are the different specific responsibilities, choose who will have each role. That will allow them to be more collaborative and less competitive. Using peer-based activities. So perfectionist students often misinterpret what their peers are doing around them, or that they're viewing them in a way so that they cannot make a mistake. You want to set them up in activities that allows them to engage, but it allows them to understand that making a mistake is a safe thing to do amongst their peers. You want them to feel like their peer group is a safe space. And so by having these type of activities, you set them up for that. Number 5, use creative assignments. So creative assignments, things with art or things that tend to have looser rules around them of what's correct and what's not correct, allows them to not focus on being perfect, but focusing on the outcome or production. So for example, discussion questions where they're answering these questions, but there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's their perspective that's being asked for. And you're hoping that, of course, they tag in the concepts from their textbook and class, etc. That would be a creative assignment that would be very good. I also have my students create infographics. So for my intro psychology students, when they do the biopsychology unit, they create an infographic. They pick one part of the brain. They have to have X number of pictures minimum. They have to have X number of pieces of information. I give them websites to help them create it for free. And it's more creative, less about you have to have a right or wrong answer. And they actually really love doing things like that. And then the last one, encourage flexible problem solving. So perfectionist students often get stuck in there's only one way to do something. So you want to make sure that you show them that problem solving is a very varied skill. And one way to do it is riddles. I love doing riddles, especially when we're talking about thinking and how we process information. Riddles are very good for that. Logic puzzles are really good. Having ambiguous problems that help the students think in other ways and allow them to get unstuck. So those are some good recommendations of implementations in the classroom. Next slide. So for counselors, and I didn't do anything from administrators because I feel like they're a little bit more removed from the direct contact with the students, but the instructors and the counselors are going to have the direct contact, whether you're an academic counselor or you're an actual mental health counselor on your campus. Number 1, discuss with them perfectionistic thoughts and behaviors. If you have time with a student and you're noticing over time these types of behaviors, you have to bring it to their attention so they can understand what is going on with them. So you want to make sure that you discuss it with them, especially when you're laying out what their goals are going to be for their academic program. And you want to talk about healthy versus unhealthy perfectionism. Yes, they can learn that they want to achieve their goals, but they can do so without having negative health outcomes. So if they don't get the best grade in a class, it does not have to take a dip in their self-esteem. They understand their value, their enough, their worth, that one moment, that one class does not define who they are. Encourage them to use perfectionism diaries. So this is a big one. I'm big on journaling because I feel like it gives us a place to just be free, unrestricted, and safe with our thoughts, and there's no worry about criticism. So with a perfectionism diary, what they would be doing is they would be writing out written accounts of their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors in connection to their perfectionism. Have them set aside 10 minutes a day to just write about different situations where they felt like the perfectionism was rising in that situation. And then have them describe what they were thinking and then what did they do. Part of the process is if you address the thought process that is faulty, that should hopefully lead to a change in behavior. But we have to identify what it is that is faulty up front in order for them to be able to acknowledge it. And journaling and diaries allow them to do that particular thing. Number 3, review coping strategies. I feel like in college, you have to give students coping strategies in general. Even if they're not dealing with perfectionism issues, this has to be given to them. So present them with examples of how to cope in a real life situation. So maybe role play what is happening if they were to get into this situation. That role playing will hopefully lead to more instinctive behavior changes in a real life occurrence. Number 4, encourage trying to do new activities. Perfectionists often shy away from things that are new because they fear failure. So encourage them to try a new activity where they don't have to be concerned about how they will perform, but just enjoying what it is that they're doing. and then have them make a list of some things that they think would just be fun to do, and go down that list and find a thing that they think will be the easiest to tackle, and then work their way from there. Number 5, teach relaxation techniques. So this can be as simple as teaching them deep breathing exercises, how to relax their muscles, learning to do things on a time schedule to give themselves a break from being too deep into activities. Also want to make sure that they practice these types of strategies in less stressful situations so that they'll feel more confident doing it in a high stress situation. And then last, discussing movies, shows, book characters that are flawed. Using art as a way to imitate life or explain life lessons is a great way to go. So perfectionists see flaws, errors, and mistakes as things to be avoided, not understanding that successful people had to fail in order for them to get to the place where they succeeded. So you want to make sure that they can gain perspective by looking at something or a character or a person that's not real, in order for them to be able to get the concept of understanding that failure is not their enemy, it's actually an opportunity. All right. Next slide. So I actually found a resource sheet for the state of Ohio when I was looking to put together resources for you, that was a really good sheet. It's a page and a half, maybe 3, of a wide variety of resources that are directed towards students and their mental health. So these are just 4. These are 4 that I highlighted. The first one is the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. This is actually a national center. It describes how college and universities can take action to prevent suicide. Number 2 is the JED Foundation. They are a community-based model organization, and their goal is to protect students against protecting students' emotional health, as well as providing suicide prevention work at the schools across the country. They work with the campuses, the leaders and professionals. They will help you create campus-wide prevention and intervention strategies. They will advise you on best practices when it comes to mental health. And they will also help you put together programs and services if you don't already have them. U Lifeline is a mental health resource center. They offer college students information about emotional health issues. So this is a direct resources for the students. They also will give mental health self-screening tools, because sometimes screening might be necessary. And then the last one I have is the Jordan Porco Foundation. This is also to prevent suicide, engaging, uplifting, empowering peer-to-peer messaging. So this will have that cooperation involved, promoting help-seeking behavior so they feel comfortable with seeking help when necessary, self-care, coping skills. It challenges stigma, which is really important, so that they feel open about speaking about the mental health challenges that they may be dealing with. Next slide. And that's all I have. And this is the time for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for that very enlightening and just, again, so much great information contained in that presentation. And so now we want to go ahead and shift and open up the floor for any questions and or any comments from our audience. And so again, you can feel free to share your comments and or questions in the chat and or Q&A function that you may have for Dr. Brown. Do see a few things coming through, a few questions coming through as well. And so, Chris, if you could actually go back to Zoom, we did have a question there that came in from Robin Davenport. Thank you so much for your question. Your question to Dr. Brown is, can you speak more specifically about the role that procrastination plays in perfectionism and how to address it in the counseling context?
So this is an excellent question. Procrastination directly connects to the fear of failure. So the reason why they're procrastinating is because they don't want to fail. So by not attempting a task or delaying attempting a task, it protects their self-esteem and their mentality, because they know in that moment they're not failing at something. So a lot of times when you procrastinate is because you're feeling like, I will fail if I attempt this. And that's usually always seen as a component when it comes to procrastination. When it comes to perfectionism, I'm sorry.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you so much for that question. Our next question is from Diane, and I apologize, I don't see a last name or organization or institution, but the question is, can you discuss race and gender differences, if any, regarding perfectionism?
So this can be varied. The racial component kind of connected to the cultural component. So it gets into what values does that race have when it comes to academic achievement, especially in racial cultures where you'll find more first generational college students, which is usually obviously your minority populations. So that will directly connect to the pressure of, I have to bear the responsibility of achieving this goal, not just for me, but for my family at large. So that absolutely plays a part in it. When it comes to gender differences, oftentimes, unfortunately, the structure is set up to where women have to work harder to achieve the same acceptance, approval, achievement within the realm as their male counterparts. So that will often be something that they feel like they're mentally battling with, that they know that there's going to be obstacles. So not only do I have to get this degree, but I have to be at the top of my class when I get this degree in order to give myself a fighting chance when it comes to going out into the professional world. So both race and gender also play a part when it comes to perfectionism.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you so much for that response. Our next question is from Sadie, and her question is, can you speak to the connection between perfectionism and challenges of letting go? An example that she gives is rumination and obsessive thinking.
These are key components when it comes to perfectionists. Number one, they don't have the ability to let go of the failures. So if you're dealing with something in the past where they've already failed, you are going to see them holding on to that. So they're going to be ruminating obsessively over that particular thing and trying to figure out a way to not have that same result. And so I think that that's the undercurrent from a symptomology standpoint of a person is dealing with perfectionism, is there will definitely be rumination, there will be obsessive thinking, and there also will be clearly cognitive distortions.
Thank you so much. Chris, I think we had a question also present in the Q&A. You didn't mind switching to that. And this question states, if a student is in a state of denial, quote, over possibly being a perfectionist, how can we approach them getting some help or getting them to open up? How could we go about that?
So this one is challenging because I'm not big on forcing a person to get help that's not ready to get help. What you can do is try the best you can to support them until they get to the place where they realize, we always say rock bottom, where they realize they've hit that wall and they know that they need assistance to go forward. You can't force them to acknowledge it. They're going to have to see this on their own. So I would say be there to be supportive as much as possible, provide the resources they're willing to accept from you until they finally come to the realization that this is not working, things are not okay, and I need to try something different.
Thank you so much. These next two questions actually goes back to the research that was referenced in your earlier part of the presentation. One question is, how was perfectionism measured?
So for that study, they use what is called the multi-dimensional perfectionism scale. And it is a 45 question self-report measure. It has 4 subscales on perfectionism. Some of the things that they're asking in those subscales is concern over mistakes and doubts about their actions, excessive concerns with their parents' expectations in the evaluation, excessively high personal standards, as well as concern with precision, order, and organization. So the MPS has been around for a while, and it's been found to be pretty effective when measuring whether or not perfectionism could possibly be a root cause to the issues that a student is having.
Thank you so much. And I believe that answers the other question regarding the author and the study information. So thank you very much for sharing the information regarding the study.
I can drop the link to the actual journal article that has the study in it into the chat so that they can look that up.
Well, if there aren't any more questions and I do see some comments that are coming in for Dr. Brown. Again, we just want to thank you everybody for your time today. This is the final webinar for this series for the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health. Actually, I do see one question that popped up. Thank you so much, Jennifer Ratt. Question is there any correlation between perfectionism and suicidality?
Yes, suicidal ideation, when I was listing some of the symptomology, there is a correlation between the two. You want me to go deeper? I can. I don't know where we are in time. Just think about feeling worthless is connected to performing. And usually worthlessness leads to hopelessness, which leads to suicidal ideation and possibility of actually completing out on those thoughts. So yes, there is a correlation between the two.
Excellent. Thank you so much for just taking an additional moment to expand out. And so there's a question, how do you receive CEs for this presentation? And so if you join just a few minutes later, in order to receive CEU CMEs for this presentation, the activity code is 55 SPIL, that's 55 SPIL, and Chris has already put that information into the chat. That code will expire on tomorrow at 1 o'clock. So please go ahead and complete that before 1 o'clock tomorrow. And again, this is our final webinar series for this academic year. We hope to have you join us for next year, starting in August, and also be on the lookout for a survey. So we sincerely value your feedback on topics like Dr. Brown, what we've been able to bring to you throughout this academic year. So we certainly encourage you all to share with us your thoughts on topics that we can continue to offer you throughout the academic year. Again, thank you all for your time. Dr. Brown, thank you again for the resources that you have provided and the information you've provided to campus stakeholders today. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.